I have a pretty active imagination. It's mostly a gift enabling me to be quite creative when I write or when I preach. It was very useful the years that I was a teacher, enabling me to bring the subject matter to life. My imagination has often enabled me to create pictures and images with words. Many people have shared with me that these word pictures can be helpful in their understanding of a difficult concept or some kind of theological lesson that might be appropriate. As wonderful as all of this might be, some of my most creative thoughts I keep only for myself. Not because there's anything wrong with them, but often because I cannot think of a way to use them in a manner that might be appropriate or useful. As a result, these very creative thoughts and images primarily inform and sometimes entertain me, and only me. Recently, I imagined something that I believed was comforting and at the same time intriguing. At first, the image was startling, surprising even me. But if you give the image a moment and see what happens, it may surprise you also. I imagined a cemetery for gods, a huge field, perhaps best understood as a garden, a graveyard, a final resting place for all of the gods that have played a role in the different human cultures and civilizations that have existed in time. It was a graveyard populated with the gods of the Greek pantheon, the Roman gods of war, peace, love, wine, and all the rest. There were some of the minor gods that are remembered in the stories of the Old Testament, the gods of the Philistines, the Amorites, the Canaanites, and other ancient people. The graveyard contained the gods of the ancient Aztec people, the mountain gods of the people of Peru, and all manner of other gods that have played a not insignificant role in the development of our human culture. As I observed this vast graveyard of the gods, populated with many graves, too many to count, I could not help but be a little saddened by what I experienced. Each grave contained a god who was representative to human beings at one time or another in human history, as important and significant, in whose name all sorts of rituals and who knows what else was done. Despite the vastness of their number and kind, not even one stood out more than any other god who was buried beside them. All of them were dead, lifeless, powerless, and for the most part barely remembered or celebrated, despite the importance they once held in the human culture that embraced, celebrated, and proclaimed their divinity. As I continued my observation of the vast graveyard, much to my amazement, as I looked over the many plots that stretched out before me, there were graves of gods that I did not recognize. So many names that meant nothing to me at all, and which I soon realized were perhaps the gods of unnamed cultures and places that were themselves forgotten, unrecorded, and not remembered. There was also a whole section of the graveyard with the tombs of imaginary gods that were representative, I believe, of distortions of divinity. These were the graves that some men and women had created, I imagine in their own image and likeness, that were even more dead, if that were possible, than the gods that they misrepresented. What makes a god die? I remarked to no one in particular, for who was there with me who might hear what I said? I know that the traditional way that a god might die in the ancient world was to be taken in battle, captured in defeat. And for the people of his time and place, that was the clearest and most well-known manner of death for divinity. Still others pass away because the prayers uttered in their name prove to be ineffectual. I imagine the gods of Baal that lost in the epic battle between Yahweh, Elijah the prophet, and others who are remembered in the story that is recorded in 1 Kings chapter 18, passed away in this manner. Still others persist only in memories carved on a tablet or stone that has found its way into a museum collection. A lonelier existence, I would imagine, than a proper burial place in the graveyard of the gods that I was visiting in my imagination. As I continued my observation, making note of the sheer numbers of graves and markers, a person that I assumed, and as it turned out was a correct assumption, the caretaker of the cemetery, approached me. We soon struck up a conversation, and he shared with me some of the experiences that he had witnessed in his role as caretaker over the centuries. He also indicated a large and still unpopulated section of the graveyard that was prepared for the gods that were yet to be buried there. Unfortunately, he replied to my unasked question, the only gods that are yet to be buried are the gods that are imagined, the creations of humankind, some of which are deliberate and intended to distract, still others that are just the product of misunderstanding and confusion. Regardless of how they are created, they all end up here. The question that needed to be asked as a follow-up to his observation was quickly asked. So, I opined with a questioning look and tone, divinity itself, the gods of humankind, where do they go? He looked at me for a moment and then answered my query with a confident shrug and a few well-chosen words. There are no more gods. There is just the one, the eternal, who always was and always will be. The only gods that still die are the imaginary gods, the distortions and the distractions. The firmness of his answer, offered without any sense of confusion and no hint of any question that might remain, did not surprise me. There was something about the truth of what he offered and the manner in which he offered this truth that did not need a response, only acceptance. And so I nodded in agreement and stood in the silence of the moment. After just a few moments, he walked away, busy with his eternal task. And I returned to my thoughts in my imagination. Imaginative stories, whether they are good or bad, can only contribute a certain limited perspective to our own appreciation and understanding. What is important about the story is not necessarily the details, but perhaps most important of all, what the story might teach or suggest. The feelings, the questions, and the thoughts that the story generates helps us to form our understanding and appreciation for what has been shared. They also provide the framework for our own storytelling when we repeat or remember the story at a later time. The details that we provide, the way we emphasize one point over another, all contribute to a deeper understanding and appreciation of what we need to hear and what we might need to learn. For Christians, formed and informed by the stories of Jesus, in particular, the stories that Jesus shared with us about his Father, his Abba, these stories are essential for our own faith, our formation, our life, our development. Christians instinctively understand that both Jesus and the Abba are not at rest in the cemetery of the gods. The one, the good, and the holy is not dead. It is not lifeless. Even more important, Jesus and Abba are not distortions and distractions. Although when their story is shared and repeated, it can be both distorted and redirected if the storyteller is determined to deceive. Thankfully, the truth of what the story represents and teaches is more expansive and engaging than any single storyteller. If we return to the original story and the original storyteller, Jesus, the power and the life of what he faithfully represented and intended, the manipulated retelling in service of some other kind of distraction, will not stand the test of authenticity and inspiration. It will collapse under the weight of its own distortions and half-truths. Due diligence is always a well-chosen perspective and very useful for a person who's trying to walk a spiritual path that leads to life. Even when we have been privileged with what we know to be true and essential, it's still possible for us to fall prey to the temptation that is as old and persistent as the stories of creation and divinity. The temptation to create a God who's doomed to die and to be buried in the graveyard of the gods. A God who is created in our own image and likeness. Far too often these distorted gods seem real to us only because they are rooted in our own fear, our guilt, our anxiety, our struggles. They seem real because the feelings are real. We confuse the feelings with the distorted image of something that we created that is incapable of life and cannot lead us to anything beyond ourselves, and the isolated vastness of the wasteland that is representative of our distorted experiences and feelings. In your imagination, I invite you to journey to the graveyard of the gods. Stand before the lifeless and the uninspiring tombs of the gods who have died, those who existed at best only to distort and to distract. Tell your story about what you believe to be true in this arena and see how it is received. If you hear only silence and if you remain uninspired and lifeless, leave your God in the place that has been prepared for such a distortion. If, on the other hand, you recognize the one, the true, and the holy in the story that you share, leave also this place of the dead. You have no need of this final resting place. There is life to live, dreams to be inspired, and the fullness of all that is good and blessed to be yet discovered.